Reading the CIE examiner's report for narrative writing, a few features stand out as being ones that you should include if you want to get into top band. First thing to note is that in their opinion, the best stories were very closely focused in time and space. So this means that you should limit your attention to just a handful of people and places. I think a maximum of 3 for each would be a good guideline. So we don't want to have stories that take place over weeks and weeks. Instead, you want to just have a couple of moments that you magnify and explore in detail. So think about magnified moments rather than long stretches of time. Now, these moments could go between the past and the present using flashbacks. That's fine, but the duration of them shouldn't be excessive. The characters need to be well drawn, so you need to think about vivid details and perhaps motivations or wishes or conflicts that help to bring your characters to life. It's a great idea to walk into the exam already knowing a handful of characters quite well. So you need to, when you're revising, think about some characters that you could use in various different scenarios. You should also think about some settings as well. Telling setting detail is important, so it's a chance to show off your descriptive skills. If you know, for example, a good city scene that you could use for various stories. It might be a rundown building, for example, or it could be a busy city square. You might also want to plan and be able to use some countryside scenes too. So don't go in there with a blank mind. You need to, as part of your revision, think about people and places that you can adapt to different questions. Note how they praised people who used original images to make mundane and familiar objects and places fresh and vivid. So you need to be thinking of some good similes or metaphors that you can use to spice your writing up like that. Scenarios need to be kept credible and be cohesively developed. So you shouldn't be including events that seem to come from nowhere. You need to prepare for these events with the preceding ones and also with the kinds of characters you've got. So there needs to be an overall consistency to your approach to the story. Characters were interesting and stimulated the reader's sympathy. This means that you need to have some insight into the character's psychology to try to appeal to the reader. Don't leave them as merely flat characters. So if you do have some villains, for example, you need to make the motivations clear. Can we at least see why they're doing what they're doing? At the highest level, responses were characterized by an examination of a character's thoughts and feelings. This means that you shouldn't be just writing an action story. You're not merely listing events. For every moment of action, you need to think about what the character's reaction is. If you, when you check your story, spot that it's just breakneck speed action all the way through, you need to slow it down, choose some moments of reflection for your characters. Although descriptions of feelings is important, however, more is required to constitute a successful narrative. This is probably the most important point in the report. You can have fully developed characters with very realistic, vivid thoughts and feelings, but you're still not going to get full marks unless you have shaped your narrative to interest and intrigue the reader. So this means that you must move away from merely a chronological recount. So beginning at the beginning, going to the middle and arriving at the end isn't enough to get you top marks. You need to have a more sophisticated approach than that. Flashbacks and juxtaposing past and present for dramatic effect are the most straightforward way to do this. I would also recommend beginning with the climax. So have the moment of greatest interest or suspense at the start to make a gripping opening to your story, and then flashback to the conflict that led up to it, then return and then deal with the falling action or aftermath.
How long do you have to write this?
So you have an hour to write it and probably about 15 minutes planning. So you're looking at 2 sides of A4, probably about 700 words maximum. It's very difficult to put a story together that does everything they want to see. So I, in my opinion, think that most people are better off doing the description because there's less to worry about. the narrative has everything in the description mark scheme, plus all this about structuring and characters too. So I think it is harder unless you have a knack for structural cohesion and you're just one of those people who can deal with characters and settings and enjoys it and has a flair for it. Vocabulary is lively and varied, and syntax and sentence structure were often effectively manipulated, especially in the creation of narrative tension. What this means is that at the moments when your writing is most tense, it might be a good idea to use understatement. So make the sentences deliberately restrained. Let the action speak for itself. Don't go over the top. Note how they say that restraint and control went alongside the most dramatic and graphic scenes. So this means things like very short sentences to create suspense and tension. Moving down from the top end of the mark scheme, middle range stories were quite straightforward in structure and approach, lacking narrative progression and drive. Here we see people who just went for a straightforward beginning, middle, end approach, and there was no real sense in the narrative of build-up or suspense or climax. No real story, even though the state of mind of the narrator was evoked. So note that you can have a fully developed narrator, but unless you've got a real story with different components to the plot, you're unlikely to be getting top band marks. Similarly, we have effective descriptions, but little happened to the characters. So one way to plan the story then would be to focus on what happened before it, what happens during it, and what happens after. So what, so what, and then what. If you don't know those three stages for your plot, what's happened, so what, then you're unlikely to have any narrative drive. So you've got to have some kind of consequences to the actions. Middle range answers were also over dramatic and relied on less likely scenarios. Going to the very bottom of the responses they saw, weaker responses were often overpacked with events or characters that weren't distinguishable from each other. So if your story is just a list of events, none of which really stands out as being more important than the others, then it's going to be lacking emphasis and shape. This is why the idea of magnified moments is important. So you choose which bits are crucial and really spend more of your attention on those ones. Skim through the others quite quickly. Note how the ending is viewed as being very important. So you must know how your story ends and plan everything around that. Know how it ends and plan the rest around it. Dialogue is useful to bring characters to life, but note that in the weaker answers, there's too much dialogue. So when you do use it sparingly. Make sure that it drives the plot forward somehow. As has been stressed often throughout the report, avoid a simple linear story. You might also want to interpret the title they give you metaphorically. So don't be afraid to go off in interesting directions. Avoid being dominated by mere events. Remember, action and reaction are important. Characterization and setting. Think of settings as being like extra characters in your story that help to bring the plot forwards. Overall then, it's a shaping of the narrative that they're after. An example that they gave full marks to for a prompt, write a story titled The Lie, focused on a Syrian refugee in a storm-tossed boat off the Italian coast. And you can see what they liked about it. So that's very limited in terms of number of people and places. And the story was structured through a juxtaposition of the present and the past. So we're avoiding just a straightforward linear account. Tight, assured plotting was evident and evocative, vivid details. Condensing all this into something that's easy to remember, if you use this mnemonic at the top of your answer during the planning stage, it will remind you to focus on just a few vivid snapshots that you have to sequence for dramatic effect. So choose which one should go next to which other ones think about past and present juxtaposition. Vivid details for characters and settings. Don't list too many or you'll overwhelm the reader. Instead, just focus on the ones that really matter. Start with the climax at the beginning to grab the reader's attention, and then you can flash back afterwards. Keep people and places down to 3 maximum. When you do use dialogue, make sure that it develops tension and conflict. Think of evasion and invasion, characters trying to hide things or find things out. There must be decisions being made with the dialogue. It has to matter. Avoid just having he said or he whispered angrily, for example. Instead, you're better off tagging speech with movement. This helps you to bring in more vivid details. Like, for example, after a character says something, you might then have he shifted awkwardly. This tends to make the dialogue more realistic. At the end, avoid cliches. Remember, they praise originality. So don't have an ending that is like a punchline that sucks all the energy from your story. Instead, let the tension linger. A nice way to end for most people is to choose a detail from the opening and just echo it. So have a circular structure. That would count as a satisfying ending. Think of your settings as being like characters. They're not just backdrops. The settings have to develop the mood and the atmosphere. To avoid making some very simple mistakes, some people also find this ABC approach helpful. So you need to check when you plan you've got some action. You also have some background detail using a flashback. We need to develop the character, have a small bit of dialogue, and be focusing on emotional response. Now, if you find narrative writing very tough, then probably the easiest way to write a decent answer is just to play this ABCDE on loop. So have some action, then a flashback, then develop the character by thinking about what's changing and what's developing within them, or show them relating to another character with a bit of dialogue, and then focus on their thoughts and feelings, then back to some more action. So that helps you avoid a simple linear account.